Thank you for checking out Real Talk Personal Finance. Shit's about to get real. Cash Flow King with you today. And today we have back a very special guest to talk with us about workplace transitions. Today's show is going to be workplace transitions featuring the Credit Union Cowboy. Before we bring him onto the show, as always, just a couple of quick announcements that I wanted to make. First one is I'm happy to report we are now up to 39 different countries listening to the show. The newest is St. Lucia, so thank you to everybody, as always, for listening to and supporting the show, and thank you to our new listeners out in St. Lucia. Okay. Got back from Vegas. My voice is a little bit hoarse at the moment. I hope I'm not getting sick. I feel fine, but apologies in advance that you're going to have to deal with me for this episode. In any case, without further ado, let's jump right into it and introduce the Credit Union Cowboy. Welcome back.
Hey, good to be back. Thanks for having me, Cash Flow King.
No problem. As you know, you were one of the top-rated guests from 2023, so it's nice to have you back. I am going to throw a little jab out to the Rent Reverend, who won the freaking contest and hasn't yet come back on the show, so hopefully he gets his ass in gear pretty soon. Today's show is going to be on workplace transitions, and before we get into that, I just wanted to sort of introduce the topic. This was something that had come up, and Credit Union Cowboy and I had talked about it and are glad to kind of bring it to you guys today through his lens and him telling a little bit about this aspect of his story. But I thought it would be all that much more relevant given what's going on. In fact, just a couple of hours ago, 2 hours and 45 minutes ago, I got an email actually from one of the groups that is in commercial real estate, one of the investment groups I'm personally invested with. Those of you that are premium subscribers know who I'm alluding to. And they sent out an email, and it started off with, many economists are warning about a near certain recession in 2024. And I won't read the entire thing, but they go on to cite and have a little table in there, some numbers from ITR Economics, who boast a 94.7% overall forecast accuracy going back to the year 1985. So nobody knows really what's going to happen. People have been using the R word off and on now, it seems like, for quite some time. Are we going to have a recession? Are we in one? Are we not? What's going on? And who the fuck knows at the end of the day. But with that said, I think it kind of puts all this into perspective and makes today's topic that much more relevant and important, and that is for workplace transitions. And so with that said, we're going to go ahead and jump into the episode today. Credit Union Cowboy, I'll let you kick it off. I don't want to steal your thunder, but you've had a relatively recent, or very recent actually, workplace transition. So talk to us and the listeners a little bit about sort of what you've been going through and some things that they maybe should be thinking about, whether or not, there ends up being the big R in 2024.
Sure. I found out in early 2023 that the organization I was with was was making kind of a monumental change, really, to one of their core business lines, right? One of their business segments. And it was the one that I was a part of. And it wasn't an immediate, lose my job immediately or anything like that, but you knew what was coming and that very few people would be kept or, maybe reassigned to the other business segments within the company. And so, that kind of set into place me starting to look and really look intently at, other opportunities, primarily, honestly, externally, because I knew that the internal options would be very, very limited with that many people, likely to be let go at some point over the years. So, I kind of had the luxury of having some time to, while I was still employed and didn't have an end date, but just knowing that was coming. I'd say the first thing is that when somebody kind of delivers that bad news. There were a lot of folks that were in our segment that thought, oh, well, we'll be okay, and it's gonna, we'll get reabsorbed somewhere else. I don't think they really necessarily saw the, the gravity of the situation. If you're in three or four lines of business as a company and you're exiting one, not everybody's going to get redeployed, right?
Yeah, right.
So going through that, I kind of took an initial approach of, all right, let's make sure that that I start looking and start, building out where I'd like to go, from here. And then that was a process that took many, many months to where now I actually have just recently started at a new company, more or less in the same field, doing a lot of the same type of work, but and actually wound up better off for it. But we can kind of walk through some of that process, what it looks like, and you know, how people can both prepare for that ahead of time, and then also how to navigate that process as it's ongoing. If that sounds good to you.
Yeah, I'm with it. Let's do it.
All right. So I know that your moniker is it's for education and entertainment purposes only.
That's right.
Uh, I don't know if we don't want to necessarily call this advice, but the best education is I would say for me is I had my resume up to date. That's something that I always keep up to date. I constantly update that. I kind of have a reminder set quarterly to look at my resume and add anything like if there's been another big project or big win or something at work to look at. It's also just a good chance to look at it and see if you like how you have things worded, right? To update it with, oh, we're in a new year now, so are the dates different if you have dates on it, things like that. Keeping that up to date, keeping your skills up to date. In a lot of roles, you're going to continue to, learn new systems or, um, you know, be on different processes or projects, whatever that is. It's good to go ahead and add that before you forget. That's something that I can tell you, I think, put me in a position back in early 23 to be ready to start looking, as opposed to at that point just starting to get the resume together. Now, I'd been with the company that I was with for over 11 years. And a lot of folks that have been with the company that long or longer, particularly a lot of folks that were teammates of mine, for example, they had not touched a resume. They hadn't, everything had been internal transfers or something for so long. They hadn't dusted off the resume in 10, 15, 20 years,
Guilty.
right?
Yep. Same here. I actually just wrote this down. Sorry to interrupt you, but we'll probably plug this for the Get Your Money Right segment on an upcoming week about workplace readiness and things like that. And updating your resume is probably going to be an action item and one that I need to take note of because, yes, I'm one of those people. I have not touched mine in 10 plus years for sure.
Yeah, and things change, right? It doesn't look the same as it did then. And for the record, the process is very different now. And we can get into this here in a little bit, but you think about how resumes are even structured, right? Are different than how they were structured 10 years ago. That constantly changes. A lot of them aren't the first thing looking at a resume these days is not usually a person. It's some sort of AI or computer program that's going to look at it. There's a lot of keyword, search on that. It's a very different document than, if you took a business writing class in college and you built out a resume, for example, or something. It looks a whole lot different than it did then. Kind of having that, I personally use an alumni career services through the university that I went to. They offer, I think it's actually twice a year, but I just use it once a year that you can have their career specialists who that's what they do full time for the university. You can meet with them and have them review your resume. And that's just part of being an alumni. It's free, right? If you're for any alumni from the university. And there's a lot of places that offer that that service. So I've done that annually. Just take it and set up a 30-minute Zoom session and go through the resume. Okay, well, actually, we'd like to list it this way. And sometimes there aren't many changes, and sometimes they've said, oh, hey, okay, we're actually the formatting that we're recommending now is this way. That's really helpful. There's actually currently, for example, I have two copies of my resume. I have one that would be the copy that you might print out and take with you or email to somebody if they ask to see it. for an interview or something, but the other one is actually one that's designed and formatted to go directly into a lot of the systems that the computer systems, because you're applying online for these jobs, right? And when you go in, you set up a profile, and then it wants to load your resume into its database and put it in a certain format so that you don't have to manually type all that in, which I can tell you is part of the somebody who just went through this process of looking for work. That's an awful lot of time. It's a full-time job to look for a job. I think we've all probably heard that, right?
Yep.
It's a really tough thing, particularly when you're employed, but also looking, having something in that format that is designed to kind of seamlessly go right into their system. That was really big.
Let me interrupt you for
So,
a second. So I'm curious, and I'm sure the listeners are too. What are some high level examples of some things where you mentioned two different versions of the resume, one which is basically going to get spit through a computer? So are you using intentionally certain keywords, things that are more repetitive in a resume like that to try to, I don't want to say trick the system because that's a bad way to put it, but to get it noticed and make sure that they understand like, hey, these are some things that are very important that I have on my resume that I want to make sure your system recognizes.
so that's an excellent question. So let me clarify here. The main difference between the two resumes is formatting. So it is, little things like how you have things indented versus not, whatever, right? That the centered or aligned differently, or what type of spacing you use or bullet you use, whatever, right? That may or may not get picked up and pulled into the system. So the main difference between the two is formatting. But to your point, yeah, absolutely. The keywords, the buzzwords, the things that you want to make sure that you feel are very important, or that mimic, the posting, right? So again, if a computer is looking at this, or even a human, they're looking so quickly for, are you a match, right? And I'll take a step back here, and then we'll get a little bit more into those keywords, right? So the very first thing that I did when I started looking was got to LinkedIn and Indeed. Those are the two that I found personally. I liked how they set up the best. Now there's many, many more, right? There's Glassdoor, there's all kinds of different job searching
Is Monster
engines.
still out there? I feel like I'm a dinosaur. Or is that a thing from like decades ago?
I'm You know what? I don't know. It might still be out there. And there's helpwanted.com, and there's just there's a lot. And
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you that in my experience, I found that Indeed and LinkedIn seem to work the best. They seem to get the right types of roles, which that in of itself is a lot of work, right? So setting up alerts for emails. Some of these, what I did basically was kind of come up with, if you're going to start the job search, I try to come up with a list of companies that I think are good to work for, that would seem like solid companies, right? So I kind of put together a list, some that are national that are going to hire remote, to where I am. And then, the local 10, 15, 20 companies, whatever, in your area that you're familiar with. That is going to vary depending on where you live, right? But put together that list, and then also put together a list of the type of roles that I think I'd be interested in slash well suited for, right? And in doing that, you kind of get this cross section. Now, I didn't only look for those roles at those companies, but I set up a series of alerts, job alerts for Indeed and LinkedIn that will send me, you can set it up daily, weekly, whatever. I had it every morning. Yeah, I would go through. That's the first thing I did. I get up before I would work every morning. I would get up and I would sift through these emails that I get for all these different types of jobs that I've set up alerts for. You can even set it up by salary, must pay X dollars or above, right? Now, that one's a little tricky because not everybody posts a salary.
Yeah. There's a lot of them that,
With
yeah, we'll say commensurate with
Mhm.
experience or something equivalent, right?
Right. So that one, you know, you at least know if they're posting it or not, but still. But I set those alerts up, and then over time you kind of refine that, because if you get one that you're like, hey, okay, I'm getting, 30 jobs in this email and none of them look like anything I want, well, then refine your search some, right? And you can do that by location. You can do, all kinds of different variables for those searches. And I did that, and I had quite a few. I actually maxed out the number of job alert emails you can subscribe for at one point in time through LinkedIn. Um, but I would go through that every morning, and I wouldn't look at 3 days old, 5 days old, because I was looking every morning. So right, so it's just the if it's new today from LinkedIn or Indeed, all right, boom, and I go and I take a look at it. So the first thing is you kind of scroll through, and it's easy to see what you don't want, right? Like if you had manager down there, and it's manager of a McDonald's. Okay, well, that's not something that I was looking for, right? I don't have any food industry experience. That wasn't, and that's not knocking McDonald's or that professional role, right? That's just wasn't what I was looking for. So, okay, you see what I'm saying? You can kind of make some adjustments to it. But I would go through and discount the ones I don't want, and then go back through and on the ones that I thought sounded appealing, click through, read the job description, and then potentially fill out an application. And that goes back to what you were talking about the resumes. When you're looking at these, what you find a lot of is, if you look at those, the job descriptions and the requirements, what you would like, ideally, right, is for your resume to match that. I think a lot of folks look at the requirements. They may or may not have it actually spelled out on their resume. They may think, yes, I can do that. But what you actually need to do is, in my case, what I did was take a look at my resume. Do I actually literally say that I've done that? Do I literally say that I have that much experience doing X or that I was a leader or, whatever the case is, right? You really want to match that and you start to see trends, right? Everything that's in this, in a technology sector is going to want these certain things. Okay, have you mentioned a particular type of system, right? Or application that you've used, that type of stuff. And then you find ways to work those into the resume. That's very important because again, that's going to help get you past that first level, which is the hardest thing because with everybody posting online and so many roles being remote, right? These days, I was working in a remote position. I'm now in a remote position. When you're doing that, the good thing is that I can apply even though I don't live where the company is, but that also means the same thing for everybody else in the country, right?
Yeah.
So it's exponential how many more people apply. So if there's several hundred applicants, right? I mean, you're trying to stand out. You want to make sure that you check all those boxes.
So is it safe to say that when you're applying for something or looking for something like this, to not make the assumption, because obviously you're applying for yourself and everybody knows themselves, everybody knows what they've done, what they're capable of, and all those sorts of things. But would it be safe to say that you almost want to put yourself in the shoes of the hiring person, right? The recruiter, whomever, that, if you were looking at your own resume, would you know that you had said experience for whatever it is that they're looking for? It kind of reminds me of like the whole presentation thing. You have to, tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them, right? I mean, you have to, you pretty much have to spell it
Right.
out multiple times just to make sure that it's clear. So would that be a way that somebody should look at that and say, okay, well,
Yeah.
does my resume literally tell them that? Would I know that if I were interviewing me, or is that not clear?
Yeah, so absolutely. So I'll tell you this. I spent a lot of time with my folks. I had people that reported to me in my prior role, right? And as I mentioned, a lot of them hadn't touched their resume forever. And I kind of went through in phases with them because a lot of them were coming from either they flat out didn't have a resume that was worth it because they hadn't added anything they'd done the last 20 years, right? Or they had something that just needed a ton of work. And we'd kind of go through and show, I'd show them the format that I used. And again, that's not saying me perfect or anything. That's just, well, I've had people who are professionals look at it, right? So this is at least a solution. I don't think there's the solution to resume. Uh, I think that there are multiple, but there are things you don't want to do, right? And so we would go through it, and after they got some things down on paper, a lot of them were what I would say would be skimpy, right? They put something in there, and they didn't necessarily put the why on the backside of it. So they'd put that they did X, right? But they left out why. Why is that important? Why do I care? Why do I give a shit, right? If I'm the employer, what does that mean? Explain to me what that means. Or they use acronyms that are within the company, right? Or they talk about a system that is, you know, in the company as opposed to let's put it like this: if you worked for a financial company that were trading stocks or whatever, and you have this proprietary software for stock trading, right? And you write down the name of that. It's called, Timbuktu, right? And you write down Timbuktu. Nobody outside that company cares or knows what Timbuktu is.
Right. Yeah. It's not universally known or applicable. Well, not that it's not
Cor-
applicable. It's not universally known. They don't know the proprietary system that you're using at the company that you work for, but it probably has a much broader application if you just simply explain
Say,
what that
I'm
is.
a subject matter expert on trading systems,
Right. Gotcha.
trading platforms, right? So that type of stuff. And I sat with a lot of my folks and just went through and I told them, I was like, I'm going to be really brutal on this. And they're like, go ahead. And then they got to see I wasn't kidding, right? I would go through and say, okay, why do I care? Why do I care? Explain that more. Well, because if you just read it, and this is the thing I think sometimes when people say they're looking at a resume with a friend or somebody, if you have to talk somebody through your resume, you lost, right? If somebody's reading your resume and they're like, "Oh, what's that?" and you explain it to them, and then you get through at the end, they're like, "Oh, it looks good." Well, it didn't look good because every time you had to say something, the recruiter's not calling you and asking you, right? The system that you pump a resume into is not going to ask you clarifying questions
Yeah. They're
and
looking
try to see
for
what you
an
left out.
expedited path for you to the fuck you pile, pretty much, so they can get on with things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you really, that kind of goes to the yes, definitely, and it's really hard to do that yourself because you will subconsciously fill in those gaps, right? Because you know yourself and you know what you've done so well, kind of like you said earlier, right? That you will fill the gaps in and read it and be like, yep, no, that's great. That's everything I've done. That's all the important stuff. And then somebody else can read it and be like, you didn't tell me a damn thing, right? And so I think it's really important to have somebody else look at it. Uh, and if whoever your most critical friend is, right? Thoughtful but critical, like have them look at it. Have them poke holes in it. Why does this matter? Why does it care? I mean, even better if they're not in the industry that you're in, right? Because they're gonna ask those questions that, particularly if you were to try to switch industries, I mean, that's very important, right? You want to make sure that you're expressing yourself in a way that is broadly applicable to people in a lot of different areas, and jobs in a lot of different markets.
But just be ready for the feedback, right? If you're going to ask somebody for that.
Yeah, be ready for it, but also like if you're not getting it, then you're probably asking the wrong person.
Right. Well, that was going to be one of my other questions. So you mentioned earlier about alumni career services and doing sort of an annual review that's complimentary, and many listeners may have that option based on their alma mater and things like that. But let's say that they don't. Are there? I'm sure there are, but do you know of any services out there that people generally utilize to be able to pay a certain flat rate or hourly rate or whatever it is, and say, hey, I want, I'm going to pay X company for a review, professional review of my resume or a mock interview or something like that? And are these places that are affiliated with some of these, I don't want to call it a job board, but essentially these tools like an Indeed, for example, where does the listener look if they don't have the friend that they want looking over their shit, or that's going to be super critical, and maybe their school, doesn't offer that service? Where do they go?
That's a really good question. I've heard of people using those. I don't have any direct experience with that because I did have those options, for myself, but uh, there's an awful lot of things out there, even local. uh, there are job clubs, for example, in different states and that are sponsored through government grants, right, and funding that help with, you know, interviewing and interview skills and whatnot. Now, do they actually do mock interviews? No, that's probably a paid service because that's more one-on-one. But like they'll have, at vocational sites and stuff, they'll have those days. Hey, you can come today from 10 to 11 and talk about this and ask questions, right? I know that exists around me. I've years ago went to some of that, and that's completely free, and you didn't have to be an alum or anything else, to do it. It's a public, kind of a public service, right? I would just say to look, in general, to Google, I'm sure there's fee-based out there as well. Uh, I would be careful to spend too much money with, with companies that, basically are offering those career navigation services or outplacement type services, if you can help it. Because again, I think you can do a lot on your own there. And a lot of times there are some free resources that, I mean, even if you just reach out to, whatever your local city, county, state government, and start looking under assistance areas, like that, there's a lot of resources out there for
And
you.
maybe you don't pay directly to an organization, or you don't pay, a sizable amount of money, let's say. But I would say, and let me know what you think about this, depending on somebody's industry and where, what type of career field that they're in, a lot of times they will have a recruiter that's essentially working for them, that's paid by the company that ends up hiring the candidate, and they're on your side in a way, because in a lot of cases they're going to get a percentage of, or at least their compensation is at least partly based upon your compensation with that new company. So do you think it's okay for people to potentially use a recruiter that's getting paid on the back end as kind of a matchmaker?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times they don't. I mean, there's quite a few companies that hire that way exclusively, right? That use, recruiting companies, to fill the roles. Now, sometimes those are more contract based, but there's full-time opportunities there as well. There's part-time. There's all kinds of stuff. I had a few interviews with those over time. Those are pretty good combos usually, and like you said, they're kind of in your corner. They want it to work for you, and they want it to work for them, right? And you're not paying them. So again, I would say that I would hesitate personally to, in my experience, obviously I didn't have to go that route. Now, also if somebody's, maybe you're in a situation where you do get terminated, an awful lot of companies, not all, but an awful lot, particularly larger companies, offer some sort of outplacement services, right? And they're going to, you get matched up with a coach for a month or 2 months or whatever it is, and they will work with you on your resume. They will work with you on interviewing skills. You kind of have a plethora of resources with some of those options to get going. So, uh, there's a lot of things, but there's also, again, just an awful lot that you can do, I think, relatively free. I mean, your local library hosts things. They might host something as well, right? Like there's community extensions, there's our county extension offices and whatnot. There's just a lot of resources out there. So if somebody's getting paid, that doesn't mean that they can't help you, but I would just hesitate to spend too much of your money, especially if you're, in the job market looking for a job or something. I think there are opportunities to save your money and still have every chance that everybody else does to be successful in finding that next role.
Okay. And maybe we pivot here for a second if you want. If not, we can go in another direction. But I was just thinking, speaking of people spending their own money, and this being a personal finance show, what is the thought process and the sort of mentality around how to prepare financially for an imminent transition, or even one that you may not know that's going to be coming up, that could be coming up, whether it's through choice or not? What should the listeners be thinking about from a personal finance standpoint?
So for me personally, which is all I can really speak about, right? But for me personally, I will say that, knowing that it was kind of imminent, for me, or at least that's my thought. Again, not everybody I work with felt the same way, but feeling that, my belief that it was imminent, led me to make some immediate changes in spending habits, right, and saving habits right off the bat. Like, okay, things that can be cut that that you're doing because it's nice or because it's not that big of a deal, but okay, we need to start, having some savings. Should things go awry, I don't want to have to, you start focusing on the things like rent or mortgage, right? Housing expense, your bills that you can't get out of, right? You know, eat eat out less if you can, all those types of things, and made a bunch of adjustments there. One of the things that I also did though was look to invest to an extent. So, for example, in the role that I was in, and I was doing, I've done project management. We'll speak broadly of it like that, right? I've done project management for quite some time, but I did not have a certification in it. Now I've done it for over 10 years. Okay, so I'm certified by the real world, but I did not have a piece of paper for that. I do have a college degree. I do have a bachelor's degree, but I did not have, those certifications. And in the world that I was looking at, so that was again early 23 when I start looking, I start realizing, okay, an awful lot of these postings, they're not under the required, but under the preferred qualifications. They have a couple different certifications listed, would like this or that, right? And so looking at that, um, I looked into those certifications, and I'm very familiar with the two that I saw most often, right? A project management professional, and then an agile certification, right? And so looking at those, I realized that the PMP certification, by the time you do books and tests and all that stuff, that can be $1,500 to $2,500. The agile certifications, you can get a boot camp and pay for the test and some other stuff. A boot camp like a 2 day or 2 day or 1 week deal, crash course, and go through and take the test and get that. And those were about $500. And what I realized was that, as much as I didn't want to spend money at that point, because of what I realized was going to happen, was that if I wanted to not be, in the stack that immediately got thrown out, if you're going against it, you think about it, there's 200 applicants, right? They can't read every resume, okay, for this job. If they're going to take just the top 10% and look, what if the first 20 people in front of you, you may have tons of experience, but if they have those certs, those are differentiators, right? And that's the biggest thing I think about resumes is what are the differentiators? What sets you apart from everybody else? And if the first 20 people in line have those certifications, why would they look at the next, 180, right? It's challenging. So I made the decision I was going to actually pay for it myself. I wound up not. I wound up getting it through I got my company to pay for it that I was still with, and it was relevant to my job. I mean, it's what I'd been doing, but I needed the actual piece of paper because externally, nobody cared that I'd been doing it 10 years. They wanted the piece of paper, right? Just like they do with a degree or a lot of things.
Yeah, there's a book, and I know you know this because we've talked about it before, and I can't remember what it is. Do you remember what I'm talking about? It's the something about
The case against education.
Yes, who's that by? Do you
Oh, I
know? Is
can't.
it
No, I do
Chaplin?
not.
Something? I don't know. We'll put a link in the show notes. I think it's called
Kaplan,
the
maybe.
Kaplan. Yeah, the case against education and signaling and things like that. Where it basically we could go down a whole fucking rabbit hole on that one about what that looks like. But yeah, okay. Anyway, continue.
Yeah, well, and again, that's the thing, right? So I'd always thought that was ridiculous. The reason I never got those before was because, well, I had my job and I didn't need to get it to have my job. I already had my job and was doing fine. And I had that experience and I knew how to do those things. I knew how to do project management. I knew how to, operate agilely. But if you're going external, part of it is you also, if, again, going back to that book, maybe it's signaling or whatever, but it doesn't, if that's the game, then you've got to play,
Yep.
right? So that was part of it. And I made that decision. Like I said, I was very fortunate to get that covered through the employer. But that I'll say that I completed that mid 23 and I had been on for several months, pretty steadily applying, right? I saw an uptick in the amount of initial screening calls and interviews that I got once I had that certification. And nothing changed. None of my experience changed. I didn't know, I wouldn't really say I knew anymore because I'd been doing it, but having that on the resume bumped you up some,
Yep.
right? Got you a little further, get your foot in the door, because a lot of it, one of the hardest parts, I think there's a statistic that I was told that it's something like one out of every 20 to 25 resumes you submit actually goes, leads to any sort of interview or contact. So,
Yeah,
so
I would
if
say I don't know what the numbers are, but that doesn't seem unreasonable to me. I mean, it seems like you got to put a lot of them out there. I know there was a time, and this is quite some time ago, where I was in a transition, and yeah, I mean, it definitely seemed like sometimes it was just it was tough, and you had to just keep with it and be consistent,
yeah,
and eventually, you get where you want to go.
well, and that's not just, I mean, the thing is that that's not just 25 that you can just throw out there. I mean, that's 25 that like you've researched, looked at, and everything. So like it's a time suck, and so anything you can do to improve your odds a little bit, right? And that would be the other thing. Since we mentioned the one for 25, is I think it's important. And again, that figure was something I was told. I haven't researched that. I'll say that it seemed accurate based on my experience. It was probably in that one out of 20 to 25 range. Definitely before I had the certification, anyway. And it wasn't like I wasn't otherwise qualified, right, for the roles. So when you're doing that, you know, I think it's important to be mindful of the fact that, like, it's really easy to get in maybe a negative headspace there. I know I dealt with that at times where you'd say, there'd be a week where I didn't see a single thing that I thought was worth posting for, and I haven't heard from anybody in a month. It's like, okay, am I gonna get something? What am I doing? Well, am I looking the right place? What else can I do? And invariably, like literally every time I started to feel that way, no joke, within the next week, I had like five different things that I applied for that were great, and I would hear back from like two of them or three of them.
Yeah,
I
and
mean,
I've heard somebody say in the past too, you really can't take it personally because when you don't have a position, and you did in this particular instance, but there's people out there that may not, right? Or they may find themselves in a situation where they don't have a position, and your full-time job, assuming you want another one, becomes looking for another full-time job. And so it's of the utmost importance to you. It's your personal situation. It's your personal finances. It's all that stuff. But to the person on the other end, you're just another item on their to-do list, right? I mean, that's one of the things that they have to do of the many, I'm sure, of their tasks that they're faced with.
yeah, it definitely is. And again, like I've told this to people, and I've said it happened to me actually a couple times of, making it down to, in a couple cases, the final two out of quite a big stack. And in one case in particular, the hiring manager actually reached out to me and told me, like, I wish I could hire two people. The other person has the exact experience that I'm looking for, down to they've done it in this type of company. Like it was project management, it was for a different type of company, and in a different industry. And they were just like, they have this literal exact experience. Well, it wasn't that I wasn't a good candidate. I was a great candidate, right? It was, if that other person didn't happen to apply, I get that role, right?
Yep.
Like that like that's mine. And that happens. And I knew that time because he picked up the phone and called me. They don't always do that, right? Sometimes you can just get that form, thank you for applying, right? And this is that was really telling, and I've shared that with a lot of people who have gone through this, because you don't know who the other, you can be great, but you don't know who the other applicants are. And so just because you're not hearing and you're not, maybe getting all the way through, well, I made it down to a panel interview and everything, didn't get it. It might, to your point, it might not be personal in the least with you. They might have loved you, but they just love somebody else a little bit more. They had one other thing, right? If it comes down to a coin flip, and that's where I go back to those differentiators, how can you put yourself in a position through your resume, through how you interview, all that stuff, make sure you're including everything that would set you apart from someone else to the best that you can. You don't want to lie, but if you want to definitely kind of, to use an old expression, make a mountain out of a molehill, do it. Make it sound as good as it possibly can. Make it sound as important as it you could possibly be seen, because that's what the other person's doing. And if not, again, it's part of the game. You'll lose if you're not doing that.
You got to make a big deal out of it to get noted. There was a guy actually at the airport last night. I heard him talking to his buddy. We were waiting for, what do you call it, to get your bags off the carousel, the baggage claim. And he turns to his buddy and he's like, hey, man, because you just see all these different pieces of luggage going around and around and around, right? And you can use the analogy and think about it, a pile of resumes, right? And most of them, I mean, there's different colors, but there's a bunch of ones that have four wheels and they're black, right? And there's different sizes. And he looks at his buddy and he's just like, I think I'm going to spray paint my neon green next time. Talk about standing out. Doesn't mean that it's any different than any of the other ones that are on there, but it's going to stand out and get the attention and get looked at first. And I think in some ways that's kind of what we're going for here.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and that's the, again, look, some of the smartest and hardest working people that I've been around, great work ethics and really intelligent, are incredibly humble, and that's a really good thing when you're working with a team, right? Or when you're at work. But when you are interviewing, when you are writing your resume, you got to take a different approach.
Gotta let your
You
nuts
just,
hang.
you really do. You really do. You want your resume should come with truck nuts on it, right?
There you
So,
go.
you want to do that, and it's kind of funny going back again to you talked about what can people do, right? If they, even if they say nothing has happened yet to them, but they're just, they think that, hey, everything looks unstable, right? And I'm not sure what would happen. The number of people that I talked to that wound up getting, you know, their walking papers, right? And they had no clue what they would want to do. They had no clue what they'd be qualified for. Because again, they'd been with the company a long time. They had no idea, right? That just like having the resume, kind of have some version of a career map, even if it's to do the same thing. There's a lot of folks who are like, well, I'd never thought about it because I liked my job. Okay, well, but think about what your job entails and where else you could do that job, right? So there's a million, you think about it, if you're in a lot of spaces, every company uses, even across industry, right? Like if you're in HR, you can do HR at a lot of different companies, right? Same thing with finance, same thing with project management, same thing with working in a factory setting, right? Whatever it is, there's a lot of different things that apply. If you're in supply chain management, does it matter what the supply chain is made up of, right? If you're in vendor management, does it matter if you're managing contracts with a third party vendor that's offshore services versus if you were managing the vendors for a ballpark? I mean, those can go across, right? And so I think again, going ahead and kind of having in your mind, like, where would I look? What are the places? What are those companies that I would put on a list? What are those roles that I would look for? What does that resume need to look like? Doing that ahead of time, that is no kidding. That if you're just starting out from, kind of from scratch, that can be a month and a half's worth of work just to pull all that together. If you don't kind of already have it, right? If you don't have a resume ready to go, it's going to take you time to figure out somebody to look at it, figure out what format you want to use, right? Go, try to remember everything you've done the last 10 or 15 years. You're going to reach out to old contacts and say, hey, what did we call the thing that we did? That stuff. If you can go ahead and have that ready, and I'd argue keep that ready, that to me was the education I was trying to give out to people of be ready as opposed to, you know, like you said, even the people that maybe they don't get any notice, they just boom, okay, you're gone today. Well, if you have those things if you just keep those up to date, a couple times a year, well, you're a step or two ahead, right? You're arguably you're closer to your next paycheck than the person who doesn't have those in line already,
Right, and you're
right?
doing that in presumably conjunction with cutting things if somebody needs to cut things. So, whatever. Everybody has their different rules of thumbs on how many months of living expenses you need and all that sort of shit. But at the same time you're doing that, if you're doing some of the things that you're talking about, you're effectively still helping and pushing towards the same goal. So if somebody had X months of savings before they ran out, for example, but they didn't do anything and it took them that much longer to find and land the next gig, well, okay. But if they're doing what you're suggesting, which is get their shit together sooner, and they have that same number of months of savings, well, then presumably they're going to land a job that much more quickly. To your point, they're going to have their next paycheck more quickly, and that's another way that they can help themselves. So you can only cut so much sometimes, you can only save so much sometimes, but this is another way that ultimately will help your finances, probably also help you and anybody like from a mental standpoint, but it's another way to try to strive towards the same goal.
Yeah, absolutely. And going through that, and again, just I think we talked about it on another episode, right? Like do people look at their uh, shopping your insurance, right, around like your auto insurance, right, or your homeowner's insurance, and looking at price. Well, I don't want to do it. I like what I have. Okay. Well, and a lot of folks feel that way about their role. But what if you had to go get this role today, right? What else could be out there? And I'll also say that particularly if you've been with a place a long time, and this isn't totally across the board, but just the way that the environments are structured, if you've been doing something a long time for a company, even if you've gotten a promotion or two along the way, um, you've probably packed on responsibility and experience at a greater rate than you have packed on money and title change. That's a pretty accurate statement across the board. Okay, unless you're maybe commission based or something like that, right? But for an awful lot of folks in corporate America, that's true. You get a raise here, a thing there, but ultimately, if you go out and look, your skills on the open marketplace are probably worth a little more for somebody else. Because if somebody had to hire somebody with the experience that, if you make a couple grand more than you did, a few years back when you got hired in, but you've got all those years of experience, well, what you're doing today, they'd have to pay somebody more because they're looking for a more experienced person. And that's the same thing if you go to another company. Does
And
that
that's
make
why,
sense?
yeah, and that's why a lot of people like to move around. I mean, I know I have a couple buddies that work in the technology area, right? And one of them worked for a very, very, very large organization. Actually, I'm pretty sure he still does. And there's another one who's worked for a bunch of different startups, and he jumps around, and his compensation has jumped wildly. Now, and this is probably beyond the scope of today's show, but there's some instances where, if he went to work for a startup, instead of, he might take a lower salary portion in cash, but get some equity on the back end, things like that. That's all negotiable. But the point is, generally, of the two of them, when they were to move around, the one that jumped around more quickly or more often, most of the time would end up with higher cash compensation than the one that stayed with the large company for a period of time, because he was getting nominal sort of cost of living adjustments and increases over time, even though, presumably he had built up a very strong skill set. He still worked for the same company, so they're not going to take him from X to, I
Yeah.
don't know, a
Well,
multiple of
and I
X.
would
They're going to just give him X plus whatever, a few percent here and there.
absolutely. Well, and I would argue that, yeah, if your rates are, 3% or 4% or something a year, and all that is COLA, right? That's cost of living adjustment. It's supposed to, kind of stick with inflation. But if you looked at, say, I don't know, the last 4 years, right? Um, those, if you are getting that standard two to 4% or something a year, you actually probably have less spending power than you did then,
Right.
right?
And that's the case
And
for a lot of people. But at the same time, you look at where things are and where things could be going, and people get scared sometimes. And, I think the best time to look for another position is while you have one for most people.
definitely, and so that's another part that I want to touch on is that we knew that there was going to be a severance offering. At least that was company policy, right? And has been for years. And there were an awful lot of folks that were hesitant to look because of that. And again, that hope that they would find something, or that something in some cases would be found for them, internally. And I think the bigger option there is to look at it and say, okay, that's great. And nobody wants to leave a severance package on the table necessarily, but those packages run out, right? That's for however long it's, depending on the individual agreement, right? But it's for a set amount of time, as opposed to if you're, unless you're right at retirement, if you're a year out from retirement and you got a year severance package coming your way, okay, that's different, right? But if you're not, if you're in the middle of your career saying, well, I don't want to give up that year, well, what about the next 20 or 30 though? Isn't that kind of important as well? And so that people get paralyzed kind of by that fear sometimes, I think, and get a little, we can all be guilty of being complacent. I like my job. I like this. I like these things, built my schedule the way I like. I have a good team. I like my boss, all that stuff.
Yeah,
And
I
that's
feel like you're
great.
talking to me here. Here's a
Well,
guy that's in financial services that probably, if he were to go elsewhere, would continue to work in financial services. And he's been where he's at for a while, but he's happy and he has a great, schedule, and he hasn't touched his resume in over a decade. I feel like this podcast is for me in a lot of ways. I need to get
I,
my shit together.
well, I wasn't, although I'm glad that it resonated, but I'm talking to myself too, because I was in that spot. And one thing that was very eye-opening when I got out and started looking and getting interviews and getting, they give you a comp range and whatever. When you start looking at that, I realized that I was anywhere between, um, you know, I was going to be in line for doing the same and or less work. I wasn't really looking for a move up. I was just trying to find solid ground, right? So I'm kind of trying to move nearly laterally,
Yeah.
and I'm looking at anywhere from a 25% to a 100% pay increase.
Yeah, that's huge.
I mean, like that's well, it's insane, and it let me know, like, oopsie, I made a mistake. I spent too long, you know, in this because I was comfortable, and it was fine, and all that. But if you want to be more financially secure, if you want to do things that, that I hadn't done, because of that, it's like, well, I was probably leaving a fair amount out there, and that's where I actually landed, was doing, getting more out of it. So that aspect, and that really becomes apparent in the process, and that won't be the case necessarily for everyone. I'm sure there are people who are, on the other hand, a little, maybe they're in a great position because they're a little overpaid, for what they're doing, and the market doesn't bear that elsewhere. But you'll find out that when you start looking, you can go look. I mean, you can go to, even without actually applying for something, look up your position and just look it up on Glassdoor and see what different companies pay that, or what the average in your area or in the country is for it.
So,
Right?
yeah, glassdoor.com, for those that may not be familiar, is basically a website that you can sign up for. And I think part of it is that you have to pretty much volunteer some information that's going to be useful to the greater audience. So, for example, if you were, like, let's say I'm in financial services. So I want to go on there and I want to see, okay, what are other advisors making? What are other financial services companies paying? Well, first, I need to be able to say, well, in my part of the country, at this firm, I'm earning in this range. Like, you have to provide some information in order to get access to some information. And the idea is that everybody collectively is helping everybody else, because everybody wants to go on there and see, well, what's everybody else making, right? But they don't want to say, well, here's what I'm making. And they kind of flip that on its head and say, well, if you want access to the information, you got to put a little skin in the game and provide that. And it's still anonymous. You're not giving your name or anything like that.
Anonymous,
But
and it's free.
Yeah, it is.
And it's free. So I mean, that it's the cost of admission is you got to play with everybody else, because if you want to, conceivably somebody else wants to know what you're making, right? So that's fair enough. That's a communal space, and until every state in the country, does what California's done, where they require you post, the salary range for positions and whatnot. And I think Colorado does too. But until they do that, I mean, that's how you know. Because you also don't want to, if you're going through that process, what you don't want to do is, there have been a couple that I applied for that I thought, looked very similar, and or maybe even just a shade higher than me in terms of what I thought it would be comp wise. And you call, and I generally, this is just, we'll get more into the latter part of this, right? So once you hit the interview stage, particularly if your first convo is with a recruiter, or an HR person for the company, I ask, just what's your range? Because a lot of times, if not, they'll ask you anyway. So I usually ask, or I've even had that where somebody asks me, what do you think? And I kind of give a, well, there's a lot of variables, and I haven't gotten to talk to a hiring manager about the specifics of the position. So I could see a big range. What's the range you're working with? Because they're all working within the range.
Right. And you're basically flipping it back to them. You're not going to spill the beans. It's kind of one of those whoever talks first loses types of things. And maybe that's a bad
Yeah.
way to phrase it. But essentially, you don't want to tell them, and then all of a sudden they were going to offer way more, or, if you were to get that position, and now they don't.
Right, exactly. And that's the fear. And a lot of places will say they don't do that, and I'm sure most don't. I'm sure that there are some that do, that they will, if you tell them a number 10 under their, bottom point of their range, they won't. But you also run the risk of, if you, and I've heard this from a couple of people, that you don't just, I think a lot of folks are saying, well, I don't want to say a number too high, and have them say, no way. Well, you're equally running the risk of saying a number too low, and they're going, no, this person doesn't value themselves, or apparently doesn't really understand what this role is, right? If you say a
Yeah.
number too low.
So, in your
both are bad.
experience, what's been their reaction to that? So let's say you're talking to the recruiter, you're talking to the HR person, they somehow get the question out to you first. You mentioned what you just did about having got to talk to the hiring manager, learn more about the position. Bullshit. Like, how much you guys paying, right? And
Yeah.
what's their reaction to that typically?
I think in almost every case, there's one that I can think of that they didn't share. In every case, they either gave me a range or more or less a dollar amount, right? And I say more or less a dollar amount because the range would be like 2 grand, and you're like, okay, so you pretty much know exactly where you're coming at.
So what happens if, like, it's they say that to you and you're like, oh, that's dog shit, that's too low? Like, what's the conversation versus on the other side of that, just for the listeners?
So in one particular case where it was the only part, and this was rare, I think this is the only time it really happened, but in the very upper end of the range they gave was kind of the floor of what I thought was acceptable, right? And I you know, said that more or less politely, right? Like, well, I thought it'd be a little bit higher than that. I've had a lot of experience doing this and whatnot. I thought that, you know, it would probably start, and I picked like their midpoint, right? I thought it would probably start there and then go up to a little higher than what you all have as the top end. Is there any flexibility in that, whatsoever? And again, ultimately, if the answer is no, which in that case it was like, no, that's, this is where we're at. You've got decisions to make. One of the questions that I asked on one that was a little bit that it was a specific dollar amount and it was a little bit lower than what I was looking for. So I started asking very detailed questions about the benefits and the remainder of the compensation package, right? Whatever 401k or type of,
Yeah,
you
you
know,
want to look at total comp. You want to get an idea.
yeah.
If one place pays a couple grand more, or 10,000 more, or whatever the number is, and their benefits are shit,
Is there travel?
yeah.
Is there, all this type of stuff? Are there various stipends and whatnot? And again, there's a lot. And in one of the cases where the number was a little low, the rest of the options, as well as the fact that it was a relatively new part of the company that they intend to grow a lot over the next 5 years, it was like, you know what, I'd be willing to take that hit for that because that's not what I'm going to be making in 2 years, right? If I go in there and do my job and do it well in a couple years, I'll be twice that because that's where that's about to explode for them. So you have to take the whole thing into account.
All right.
Um, well, I would just finish by saying I would not have you. I think people, just based on what I've heard from others and myself included when I got started on it, are scared to ask. We're almost conditioned, right, to not, oh, you can't ask that. You can't do, you absolutely can. One thing that I would encourage everybody to think about, you're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you, right? Now you don't want to come off that way and like run everything, but your questions are every bit as important, right? And this has to be a fit for you. This is what you're going to do all day, every day, right? You need to understand where your mind is at ahead of time. I mean, if that's your drop dead number, then that's your drop dead number. But if it can be impacted by, hey, there's more days off, or hey, there's more, they pay a higher percentage towards medical insurance or something, whatever the case is, kind of know that going in, where you're at with things. And don't be scared to ask that. Don't be scared to, politely push back on them some, because they should be able and willing to go back and forth with you. And ultimately, if they just stonewall you and say, well, I can't tell you, then okay. I mean, that's another thing for you to consider. Like, okay, well, if they can't even tell me and I'm getting interviewed, you know, do I want to continue? Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but it does tell you something, right? If they're stonewalling you at that point and you're one of the few that's getting an interview because they're not calling everybody that applied, that does say something to you.
Has it ever been way below expectation to the point where you just kind of want to end the conversation and move on? And if so, like, how do you do that in a polite and professional way? And if not, if that did happen, what would you say?
Yeah, it didn't happen to me except for the one time where all the other things aligned, where it was like I can handle that being a little low. If it is, I mean, I think about it like this. I've had a couple of recruiters over the time reach out to me from without me applying for anything on either LinkedIn or Indeed or something, right? They shoot you an in message and they're like, "Hey, I'm hiring for this, and would you be interested?" And I always just ask a couple questions, and a couple times like it's not really around salary, but some of them have been, oh, it's contract. I'm like, I really appreciate you reaching out. Thank you. If you have anything with like a full-time option, I'm more than interested, but at this point, I'm not interested in contract work, right? So like you can be very respectful about it, but ultimately, if it's not for you, it's not for you. And it's the same, it'd be the same with pay, right? Like, hey, this seems like a terrific opportunity and I'd love to, but just personally, I can't make that number work for myself and my situation right now. But I really appreciate your time,
Yeah.
right?
No,
And
that's
again,
good.
be
I like that.
respectful and just it ultimately, like, they don't want you to take a job that you can't. I mean, and if they really love you, who knows? They may go back and say, hey, all right, we got to get some more money for this position, you know? But again, you don't want to get in there. I think it would be bad, for me personally anyway. Like, I would hate to get in there going, my God, I'm so underpaid. right? Like right off the jump, you don't want to start there.
Yeah.
That's a rough way to start your first day in a
And
new
you
gig. So
also don't want to, and I know somebody this happened to, you don't want to go through the entire interview process, presumably multiple interviews, only to find out at the end what those numbers are or what the range is. And if it turns out that they can't do anything, I don't want to say you wasted your time and theirs, because I guess it's good experience, but you probably want to know on the front end so you're not spinning your wheels.
So I would say 90% of the interviews I went through started with it's a pre-screening basically call, right? With somebody in their HR department. Okay. Either a recruiter, talent acquisition, whatever you want to call it. And those tend to be very brief, and they're a lot of times, and 75% of those, I'd say, they led with, let me tell you a little bit more about the position. They'd tell you like three things, one of which being the salary range, because they know that that's a thing for you. If it doesn't start out that way, again, I'd ask, even if they ask you first, flip it if you can. Ask them. There's nothing wrong with that. You won't be the first one to do it to them. Don't be a jerk about it and say, well, no, you tell me, right? Like, I mean, there's a way to handle it. But I think having that combo, just get the numbers out in the open. And that way, even if you're on the low end of a range or whatever, you're okay, right? And it really opens up that combo. And like I said, the majority of the cases, that's how it happened. It went really well. They want to make sure, because they don't want to waste, the hiring manager and whoever else, whatever panel you're going to sit through, that's hours, right, of their employees' time that they're paying, right, and hours of your time. Nobody wants to waste anybody's time. So in that initial screening, I think that's one thing to make sure, hammer out if you can that, the compensation details. Hammer out if you can as many questions. Yeah, there's several times where I ask questions and the recruiter would say, I have absolutely no idea. You'll have to talk to the hiring manager. Well, good. Sounds like I made it through the next round, right? So that's, show up prepared for that, even though they're going to say it's just a 15-minute call or just a 30-minute call. Show up prepared like you would for an interview. Have your questions ready to go, and make sure it's not one-sided. Nobody's going to advocate for you if you don't advocate for yourself, right? Nobody's going to ask you or ask questions that you want asked if you don't do it. So similarly with the you know um, what you want to make with the comp and whatnot, ask the questions. I know a lot of folks probably don't want to initially because there's there's a concern that, well, would that be off-putting? I'm asking about money. Well, none of us are working for free,
That's
best I
right.
can
I was going to
tell.
say that. Nobody works for free unless you're the cash flow king on the Real Talk Personal Finance podcast. We work for $3 a month.
But that's my thing, is it's no different than when they ask you, because they have no qualms asking you. You shouldn't have a qualm asking them. Like, just go ahead with it. Again, make sure your tone's right. Make sure you're respectful about it. If you haven't done it before, say it 50 times before you get on the phone about how you're going to ask. Make sure you like how you're going to say it. Rehearse a
Yeah,
little
there's
bit. Same
nothing
way you're
wrong
going to
with
rehearse
role
the
playing
answers.
either.
No.
I mean, I think that's a good thing. It's a good exercise. It can be a fun exercise, just to kind of get things out in the open and just get used to answering certain questions and just have a little bit of fun with it. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And again, overall, just remembering that it's not personal, and then trying to keep that, positive attitude as much as you can. It's going to, I know for me, it took a long time, right? I said it was early 23, and I just, it was the end of 23 before I landed something, right? So it's challenge to stay positive. Now, granted, I was employed during that time, so I had the luxury to be a little bit selective on what I was looking at. I did have a broader scope than I would have had I not known, that likely I was, going to be impacted eventually. And had I completely lost, my job or everything, or lost severed, anything like that, the scope would have gotten even broader, right, on what I'm willing to look for, because you do have to do that, but you also don't want to necessarily, if you can possibly afford it, you don't want to necessarily do something that's going to be an anomaly on the resume, right? That sticks out and goes, wait, what happened there? Or if you're giving up a ton of seniority, or moving to a job that's maybe just, even without seniority, just a lot less intensive than what you've been doing, that's if you can avoid that, I would say, just again personally, like that's something I was fortunate enough to be in a position to try to avoid those things. Don't take something just to have it. Still, as much as you can, try to maintain focus on what's reasonable, right? Things that you're going to be a good fit for, and that you're going to, enjoy hopefully to an extent, right? And how you get those roles, and then just stay persistent with it, and realize that it's going to be a lot of firing off, applications into the void and never hearing back, and that's okay. That's just part of it.
Yeah, and in a perfect world, yes, I would agree with that. But at the same time, I've always been a believer in you do what you got to do to survive and feed your family if push comes to shove. So just because you can't necessarily make, a lateral move or even a move on the upswing, if something happens, and yes, ultimately, ideally, you'd like to be able to be patient and get the position that you feel as though you deserve. If you got to, do some kind of, I guess they call it gig type work now just to put food on the table, not that that's something ideally you want to have on your resume, and you may not even put it on your resume. I don't know. I've been out of the game for a while, but I think that says something too in terms of being willing to do what it takes, because sometimes, there's might be some people listening to this that they're like, well, you guys are on fucking another planet here, buddy, because you know what I mean? It's like, I got to do what I got to
Yeah,
do. I got 3 kids and I'm a single parent and I work 2 jobs and da 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 da. I mean, everyone's situation is going to be different, but you do what you got to do to
absolutely,
put food on the table too.
absolutely. And it, like I said, that I realized I was fortunate, and then that's why I use that word in my position to not have to. You're just looking at the size net that you're casting, but I would just always have the net ready to go.
Yeah.
That's the biggest thing. Not, like you said, if the big R, right, is coming, or even a small R or medium R, right, if that's coming, or if we're in it, already, be, it's the Boy Scouts, right? Be prepared. What can you do? You can't, I couldn't do anything about the fact that the company that I'd been with decided to, you know, exit the line of business that I worked in, right? That wasn't personal. That wasn't on me. It wasn't like, oh, we're gonna, take out Credit Union Cowboy, right? That wasn't it. But the best thing I had done, I'd already done in terms of being prepared,
Yeah.
having that stuff ready to go. And that, for the record, I understand with everybody. You mentioned people, working 2 jobs, doing all this stuff, and that's, oh my God, and I got to do that too. Yeah, it sucks, and it's not fun. Like I said, it wasn't fun waking up early, for basically a year to work before work to try to get another job, right? Like that's not easy. It's not fun. There's sacrifices, right? But it's something that it definitely pays dividends, just like having the resume, having, an idea of where I would look and what I'd look for, having that already kind of mapped out, having that career game plan of, hey, if something went south, what would I do? Having that, you talk about emergency funds, right? That's an emergency plan
Yeah,
for,
100%. 100%. That's what I was going to
so
say. That's part of my big takeaway from today's episode, and I'm sure for the listeners too, is that there's the financial part, there's the emergency fund, there's the savings, there's all that, but then there's the preparedness part, like you just said, emergency plan, where that has a direct impact on what you may or may not need to have in those same emergency funds, emergency savings, because the more preparation and things you can do now to position yourself well, hopefully the shorter amount of time of a gap there's going to be, if any, between position A and position B for people, and that will give them a little bit more breathing room. And I think that's important because, like I said at the beginning of the show, I'm guilty of it myself. I've not dusted off the resume in over a decade. I probably need to do that, even though I have no plans to go anywhere anytime soon. You just never know. And you'd rather be prepared and be ready to go than all of a sudden you wake up one day and you're like, what the fuck just happened?
well, and yeah, and on top of it, not only are you just then starting, right? Like let's say you got, you, heaven forbid, right? But you got word tomorrow that your position's eliminated, right? If you do that, for the record, you're not starting on the resume probably tomorrow, because there's a whole grief exercise, right? You're going to go through, that most people are going to go through probably, right? Where they say, "Oh my God, what are we going to do?" And they, you know, there's a mourning process. It's a whole thing. It shakes you, right? And again, if you can, so it's not just that it's, well, let's say it takes a month. It's not just that it's going to take you a month. It's going to take you a month and a week because it's going to take you a week to get your headspace right, to even start. I'm telling you to be super positive and be, embellish your resume and make yourself sound great. Well, right after you're terminated is not the best time to do that because you don't feel great, right?
Yep.
You probably don't have that, positivity and self-worth that you had the day before. So that's why I would say it's even more important to do it earlier because not just like the timeline, but it's gonna be hard to get started because your headspace is likely to be a little bit different. It's likely to be a little bit different when it happens to you if it does. So yeah, I think it's really important to have that in. Again, you're going to fire out a lot, not hear back. At least, that was my experience, and that seems to be the standard. The interview process, do everything you can to prepare. And, like you said, some role playing. If you got somebody that, you know, figure out who one of the more successful people is. If you don't have somebody at work or something at work that does that, I think some places even do interview coaching internally for folks that want to apply for internal positions. Look for these opportunities, and I would look for them in advance of needing them. That's the big thing, right? I mean, if you can look for it in advance, you don't have to apply, you don't have to do that, but it doesn't necessarily cost you anything to be ready to go should you hit an event where you're going to need those things. To already be ready, you said you've been with the company a while too. Even just interviewing, it's a process. If you haven't interviewed, with another company, maybe you've moved internally and I call those sometimes pseudo interviews, right? Because it still feels safe, right? You're in the friendly confines. Maybe they know somebody within the organization, right? That's one thing. But if you're actually going to switch companies, you know, it's daunting, right? You've got to log into whatever system they're using for video, right? And uh, do it that way, get that set up. I mean, so even going back to having your LinkedIn in order, like having a LinkedIn, you know, again, one of those I know a lot of folks feel like it about the way they do about Facebook or something else. Like, I don't want it, it's social media. I'm not telling you got to use it and post all the time, but can you have one? Because I'll tell you this, this is just a note that I forgot from earlier. I'd say over half the time that I got selected for at least a screening or beyond, right? I would get a notification from LinkedIn that somebody within that organization viewed my profile on LinkedIn. Now, I don't know if it was the recruiter, the hiring manager, I have no idea, but somebody was looking at it. Now, I don't know if they just did it to see if it matched my resume. I don't know if they did it to see a picture of me. I have no idea what they're using it for, but I'm going to venture a guess that above 50% number, if they go out there and I'm not there, they're probably going, why does he not have a LinkedIn?
Right. And
Why is
not
he not
even
out
just
there?
not even just to LinkedIn too, but like another thing that will come up from time to time, and this is even, back in the day when I was an undergrad many, many, many years ago, and we were talking about, we had companies that would come out to the university at the time and do mock interviews and do all that kind of shit. And people would always say in career services, they'd be like, you all really, and this is back when I think Facebook like was first like a thing, and even today, you need to be mindful of what's out there on social media that somebody can readily access and view about you, because your LinkedIn profile might look great, might look like it matches the resume, might be very professional and all that sort of thing. But if you're out in Vegas with the cash flow king at the craps table doing shots or whatever, you know what I'm saying? Like, that's a different story if you're posting that on the Facebook page. So you just need to be careful about your social media presence overall, I would say.
Well, and we'll take it a step further because again, we're talking about things that people say, well, why does it? I've heard this many times, right? Why does it matter? That's mine. That's my personal say. Yeah, it doesn't really matter what you think about it, right? As long as they're legally allowed to look and make their own personal assumptions on things, what matters is the perception, right? So if that's not what, they're going to want to see, don't have it out there. And I'll take it a step further because this is something that I've seen. I just firmly believe that everybody should have a professional sounding email address. And here's what I'm saying there. When when I was younger, right, and email kind of first became a thing, it was always like, at the time anyway, don't, of course we were, much younger, but don't use your name, don't use your real name, come up with, and it was something silly, right? You think about back to like AOL, everybody had their screen names that were ridiculous, right? And it would say that at, AOL.com or whatever your ridiculous screen name was, right? And that type of stuff, again, whether you mean for it to or not, or whether it should matter or not, it sends a message, on a job application, which what your email's gonna be on there, or when you create a profile within a system, it does, and for a company to apply for a job within their system, it's gonna look a little weird. So if you've got one that's, funky, and maybe you think it's great, maybe if you want to keep that for your personally, that's fine. But having one that, is a little bit, John.doe123 at Gmail or something, that sounds a little bit better than Johnny Cracks Corn. Like it's a little bit different vibe. So again, that's something that I think a lot of folks that maybe haven't, they haven't touched a personal email in 20 years for that, something to think of, because it goes right in line with the LinkedIn or the Facebook or anything else. Everything that you do, your entire footprint, right, on the internet, be that social media or otherwise, does send a message, and people do make judgments on that. They do. It's just, again, it's reality. So whether or not you think that's something that should matter, it goes back to the book we talked about, and, signaling, whatever. It doesn't really matter. If that's the game, you got to play.
Yep. That's correct, sir. Very good.
So, but I think that's about it. Any other questions for me about my experience?
But I think for workplace transitions, I think we covered a lot today. I think some of the main takeaways are, just as you would prepare your finances, prepare your skill set, your resume, your professional appearance and profile, from everything from your email address to your LinkedIn profile to your Facebook. And so that's all good. Updating your resume, keeping it updated, that's something I have on my to-do list now, because it's just, I think, would be an interesting exercise. I've not done it in quite some time. We talked about a couple different websites people can use. You mentioned Indeed. You mentioned LinkedIn. Making a list of roles and companies that you might be interested in. Check to see if your alma mater has any sort of alumni career services offerings, like you mentioned, for your annual resume review, things along those lines. And then just
your county extension office, government, things like that. Again, they offer a lot of services to the community.
Yeah, that was my, you stole it.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. That was my next thing. I was just looking at my notes. So, no, I think this has been good. Hopefully the listeners found it helpful. I know I did, and we appreciate you coming back on the show. I'm sure we'll have you on again this year. The plan is to have, as long as the listeners are giving good feedback, to have guests that want to come back on for different topics. I think you've told your story in a couple different capacities, which I found interesting. I think the listeners probably found it interesting. And as always, we appreciate you being on the show. So,
I appreciate you having me on and let me share my experience with everybody. So hopefully some folks find that helpful. Thanks for having me.
And if you guys do, and if you have any questions, we can forward them along. You can email the show, realtalkpersonalfinance@gmail.com. And we can send them over to Credit Union Cowboy for some feedback if there's something that you want to hear more about, and we'll kind of go from there. So, yeah, thanks for being on the show. We will see you in the next episode.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.